Hey folks, I'm Ali. I'm an environment artist from the UK, and I just have completed, kind of, this scene recently, a Blade Runner cyberpunk scene, that I just wanted to show you how it's been made, um, the processes for the props, the kind of thinking behind it, its inspirations, and today I'm going to give you a kind of, I guess, a bit of it is going to be a little bit slideshowy. But I also kind of wanted to break that up with some fly-throughs of the scene so you can see it in motion. So I'll start off with the, I guess the inspiration that it came from. It was unofficially entered into the EXP Dynasty Cyberpunk Challenge that recently finished. I say unofficially because I actually started making, I think, 10 days before they announced it, so that was a that was a bummer. But they still allowed me to unofficially participate and be involved in the chat, and I believe my work is going to get looked at, and that's something that I really wanted. So I started gathering references for this actually back in December, and then I started making in. It started with the blockouts and making in mid-Jan. So I've got some references here from the Cyberrunner scene from Josh Van Zuylen, and on the right of that, I think there's the scenes from Wick the Omen, from Quixel, and his is a Blade Runner scene, and whilst I think his is really impressive and like technically amazing, I kind of wanted to push mine off in a slightly different way, and I'm saying now that I kind of I guess my way into cyberpunk is through Blade Runner, and whilst Blade Runner is kind of its own thing, there are definite overlaps, and the debate still rages, I guess, as to, you know, neo-noir and cyberpunk and the different interpretations of a dystopian future. But I'm going to start rambling. If I go up into if we look up in the top right, there was a VR Blade Runner game, so that was useful. I actually contacted that studio to just ask about some of their approaches during the process. So this was some projects that have been completed. I was looking around the internet for kind of other broader architectural ideas, and then some zoom in on props, some detailing. That's Sadie Fofana at the bottom, with just an absolute bananas level of detail, which I loved, and I kind of took inspiration from that kind of building in the central part of my scene, which you can kind of see here. I'm not hitting up the same levels of detail, but that kind of busyness in the middle of the scene, I kind of wanted to help lead the eye with it being the focal point. And also the idea that this is taking place within a much bigger world. So, you know, it's a bit difficult when the camera's not pointing up or it's not like hundreds of meters away, but I kind of wanted the feeling that my scene was at the bottom of like a kilometer high building, mega complex kind of thing. And a lot of that I thought was going to be down to lighting. So the next references I started gathering was the idea of it being kind of at the bottom of a well, or it being sunken, like underwater. So I then started, actually one of the perfect shots was kind of in the bottom right half down here. I love the blueness of it. So that was a kind of a bit of a North Star for lighting. So this feeling of being underwater, or a really like in an alleyway or at the bottom of a well, I wanted to push, which I think the daylight and then all these kind of neons could make for quite a striking sense of atmosphere and place. And that was all going to come together by, I mentioned about Victor's scene. I wanted to push it off slightly more towards Sid Mead's concept art, which still, every time I look at it, I'm just blown away by it. It is so beautiful. And I really hope I can find a way to get some of this printed up big and put on the wall. But you can see there's giant kind of off frame lighting, like quite a lot of these you know, up in the top right. You don't see the light sources for quite a few of these the way that this building is kind of illuminated by purple on this aspect, or the kind of greenness over here. So there's off-frame lighting sources, but also I think the big thing was about how to work with a color palette that's not completely technicolor, like not every single color needs to be in there. He's kind of working with the spectrums of yellow and green and blues and purples. It's kind of almost like 3/4 to half of the color wheel, but then he goes in with accents of orange. I don't think he uses red, so I think I almost absolutely stayed away from red. I think there's a couple of tiny bits of red. So that's the kind of, oh yeah, right in the foreground there's a little red thing, but it's not lit. But you can see I've tried to echo that sense of lighting, and I'll just give you so this is turning all of the widgets on, so this is huge amount of decals and splines, which you can see projected and stretched across the place. I knew from quite early on that I wanted to do a street scene from ground level, and I started off with some blockouts, as you can see here, that initially were really close up, and I was in it, and I was struggling. I had this idea in my mind of like, I wanted to get this sense of an overhead space, and was struggling to get the camera working with it being so close in, and I was trying out some portrait formats and wasn't really happy. But that's what the blockout stage is for, right? You're working out the composition. You try and work fast. I went in too detailed here. You can see that all those small pipes and stuff don't need to be there. So that was a lesson learned. But I'm kind of skipping ahead here. But you can see I'm starting to build the blockouts in this scene, and you can already start to see this sense of kind of angles and actually of composition of almost three distinct buildings. If you cut them down in vertical slices, you've got this kind of, and I'm already starting with some basic lighting, but you can see these pillars kind of punching back in, and this sense of an overhang really creates an idea of overhead weight, and that extends out beyond the frame, so you do start to feel that you're at the bottom of something. So that's also architecturally is supporting the idea. And just trying to bring in some interesting shapes into the pillars, because the amazing thing about Blade Runner is this kind of, I don't really know how to describe the architectural style. I guess it's Art Deco or Art Nouveau with very techy elements, but grubby tech, like lived-in tech. But a lot of the stonework in the columns, they're all very ornate, but they're, to my knowledge, they're not placeable to it. You know, they're not European, or they're not Asian in their detailing. So just working through some of the blockouts, and you can see I'm kind of starting. This one's quite an interesting one. It's a tiny change, but you can see because the daylight, the sun is kind of almost up around the midday point, and is a little blue. I start to realize, oh, if I start to have these downward facing lips, that's how you pick up these little highlights. Of course, that's the case in most prop making, but in the scene, from the camera level, I was thinking about was, okay, I need to start having these little diagonal shapes on things to catch the sunlight. And already I've started bringing in these spiral columns on the left, and they stayed in that position for the remainder of the thing. And these central pillars, which initially were really throwing off the scale, so they got scaled down. And we're just playing around here at this stage with, should it be higher on the right, lower on the left? Should it all be at ground level? I think I did end up going for the same level in the end. And instead, to give a sense of depth or a variety, brought the building that was closer to the camera further out, so they're kind of staggered in terms of their depth along the foreground to background axis, if that makes sense. So started then to also put some more structural ideas in here, some piping, building supports. You can see in the green area I've started to bring in the shape of what will become some sci-fi pillars, and they're set against these kind of ornate stone columns. And finding some extra camera shots. This one is one that hasn't yet made it into the final project because there's some waterfalls coming down in the way, and was struggling to really get something I was happy with here. But I ended up getting the pillars in a much more interesting shot. This is the shot that I definitely want to pursue. I'll just take you into the scene. So this is kind of down in this angle, because I got some good props around here, some nice kind of industrial things. I'll talk more about this unit a little bit later. Got some cool columns, some kind of striking backdrops, but I couldn't find something that I was happy with. Obviously the hologram here is blowing it out at the moment, and this is kind of getting in the way, so just needs a bit more tweaking. But I couldn't help but feel like I just needed more clutter. I've got a little bit here, but it's just not quite hitting for me at the moment. So yeah, that needs working on. I'll just jump into basically, once I kind of knew this was the composition, I could have spent more time in here to really nail this down, and I think I'll do that for my next one because the scale is off. The ceiling in the green area is too high. The columns, the yellow columns in the middle are too big, and the overhang that they connect to is too high up. So I know I've got the men in there, but it's not meshing at this stage, and I did manage to fix that in the end. But I kind of jumped into making the first trim sheet, so I needed to remind myself how to make trim sheets at this point. So I started following along to Tim Simpson's trim sheet tutorial, and this was a trim sheet for making this central old building, so stone. So I started going in and sculpting the stone work here. I had an issue with the subdivision here, so I went back in and fixed that. Just really breaking up the edges, and I was using a stylized brush, and I was actually happy with the result. I would have liked to have made it a bit more my own. This is extending the trim sheet so it's mirrored on both sides, but so that the AO bake comes out okay. And then this is the first iteration of the trim sheet, and you'll see a little bit further on that the diffuse values are actually way too dark. But you get the idea. 3D geometry baked down onto a 2D mesh that you can then go and unwrap geometry that you make, and you can project these strips onto it. So I started then, this is the beauty of trim sheets, as soon as you have that, you start working real quick. So made this, very, very quickly. You've got all these kind of normal edge wear along the sides, and you multiply that, you get a building. So I was happy with that. The material needed more work, so I did go back and tweak that. I didn't spend a huge amount of time on this material because I knew that this was going to get covered over in cables, and it was mostly going to exist in shadow. So I ended up also using this trim sheet to make these side supports to give it a nice sense of kind of weight. And this was ultimately I would have loved to have made something as good as that. I didn't get there. The level of granular detail here, and the way that the cables snake around bits of stone or boxes that emerge out, is just something that I'll get there, but I couldn't get there in the period of time that I had. So you can see initially brought it in, and it was just super dark. So the diffuse values were way off, needed to go and fix that. Was having issues with my spline meshes here, so this is onto cables. This was my initial cable blueprint. What I found actually really helps, it's almost like the spline mesh blueprint, the spline mesh gets confused as to which axis the mesh should continue along. And say, for example, if I was to click at any one of these little dots and you just drag them forward or backwards, the mesh actually figures itself out, and I didn't know that until quite late in this project. This is some attempts at trying to get a comparable kind of level of depth and detail into the building, like I was talking about with that concept art here. I didn't end up pursuing that. I kind of just wanted to focus on other things. This is a second go at the cable spline blueprint, which the second time I went around with it worked a lot better. And then this is showing the underside of the pillars. So ornate columns set against a very kind of industrial science fiction style column. And then the underside of a more shop area. And moving on to the second trim sheet. So this is the overhang to go in the middle over here. So it's a kind of East Asian influenced ornate overhang. And the ridges in this, I think, really help so that's a texture problem, really help, I think, offset a lot of the, well, they catch a lot of detail. It's nice having that detail around that area. There's a lot of, the big piston building over here, I call it the piston building, is very almost, it's almost functional brutalist. This is actually, shape of this is kind of working from a Sid Mead sketch that I can see in the background of one of the scenes, and then this is actually just a big kind of curve, really basic shape. So it's nice to have some kind of structural detail there. And then going into work with the supports, figuring them out as trim sheets and how they meet the ground. And starting to think about the thicknesses of these edges, and basically jump straight into another trim sheet here. Initially had this kind of coloring for the metal, and the roughness was off, and the orange wasn't working. You can see that the roughness value is too low, it's too shiny. So I went back in and rusted them up, put them into the kind of green area, so you've got this kind of reddy brown and green, and these are the lighting at this stage was so bad that you can barely tell that they're in there, but it was progress. And then in the middle, these are these kind of building supports doubling as like a piping kind of thing to get piping into the building. So I just made some basic meshes, some materials for some more splines. I think this was my third go at a spline blueprint at this time, and this is what was happening. I following this found out about the just gently moving them in along a kind of perpendicular axis. Actually, that's the way to describe it. Fixes them. And then the piston building, which you can see here, has some smoothing issues on the bottom, but I was unwrapping it, so this is a big tiling texture stretched around here, and got this to a stage where I was like, okay, I'm not happy with the materials, but it's coming together at least. If you look down at the curb side, there's a cut back into the pavement now, which I think really helps break up that line and create a sense of more of a focal point around where the character is at the moment. Then started figuring out how do you unwrap something that is a weird spiral column, where I wanted to keep the geometry. I didn't want a normal map. It's kind of luxurious in that way, but I just wanted to have that profile and silhouette not just be a smooth thing. because the camera was in some of the early shots going to get close enough up there. So this is trying out some different ways of baking, was having some issues with that, and then did eventually find something, as you can see here, where the entire, I think it's about 4 meters or more, sorry, it's 9 meters, comes out. And this is one of the kind of lights that goes up on that piston building. I think I ended up unwrapping 2 of these per texture set, so they're a bit more efficient. And then I'm showing you the end product here, but this is when I was doing some sculpts for the curbs. So I think I ended up sculpting 4 in total, and that's including curbs and steps. This one, I probably could have dialed it back a bit, like that's a bit too much, I think, in terms of the situation. Like, it's not a heavy, like there's not giant lorries running over this. I did want it to look beaten up and old, but probably could have found a middle ground between this and this. But I think that looks pretty good. It's like its roughness is so low, like it looks so wet because the scene is raining. And I guess if I wanted to have some more specificity with the materials, that would probably be a kind of mid-level, 0.5 or 0.4 on the roughness, and then go in with a material blend and paint in, streaks down the side of it. But I was trying to pump stuff out pretty quick, so I'll just show you how I went about doing that. So I basically had a high poly sculpt that I then unsubdivided, and then I reduced it. At that point, I placed the UV seams. Then I went back in and decimated some more, and you end up getting triangles everywhere. But it kind of retains a bit of the UV seams, and then I kind of went back in and manually straightened them out, and you end up with something like that. This is how it starts off. So you end up with that, and then you get some pretty reasonable unwraps. These are 2 of the steps that are side by side together. I was kind of sculpting in some like footwear into them. Once again, I think I probably put a bit too much in it. Probably could have found a middle ground, but you get the idea. So I'll just show how they look in the scene. So these are the super big chunky. Maybe it's easier if I show unlit. These are the super big chunky curbs. Over here, you see that's the really beaten up one. And then these are some of the steps coming in. So happy with how they worked. So that's them in lit. I think the wetness on them is okay, but yeah, more specificity would have been good. And then working on some small details. This is kind of getting back into some 3D modeling, kind of not theory, but practical approaches. I think I was following an Aramis 3D tutorial for this, so this is working out the best way to sculpt cylindrical details. You can start off with something that's more like a pie on the left, or you start off with quads and you end up being able to generate kind of these circular details on the left, or you create more boxy things. So that was a useful exercise actually, because I am still learning in this department. And this was the block out for that sci-fi pillar. So here you can see I'm jumping ahead and starting to create the high poly. I think this was a subdivision. I'm using Blender, so this was a subdivision approach. So I was doing a high to low poly baking, and this is the high poly, and then you've got the low poly over here. This is dividing it into 2 texture sets, or applying 2 materials, so that in Substance Painter I can have 2 texture sets. And this was the first bake I did, and it was was working pretty well, and just literally threw a smart material on it just to see, okay, how are the edges looking, what needs tweaking, and I did go back and forth into the UV layouts to straighten some stuff. So jumping around a bit here, so sorry about that. But this is finding more ways to reduce the try count on the curbs and the steps. And then this is basically going back to that sci-fi pillar. So you can see, I think this was one of the, this is the lower half of that pillar. It's the UVs, some initial baking things. I still don't know why these were occurring, but I ended up fixing these and then starting the texturing process by going a little bit crazy with the, with the undercoat, and then dialing it in. And I got to this stage knowing I wasn't happy with it, but it was going in the right direction. You can see there's just kind of illogical color choices, really, like the curb at the bottom in turquoise, the kind of pink cable. It just wasn't harmonious. This is a step further to it being improved, in my opinion. Just dialing it in, and then this is how it ended up. So actually really happy with how this turned out. This was a bit for someone like me who doesn't have a background in 3D modeling. I made it and I was like, oh, okay, I can do this. This is good. Still obviously plenty to improve on, but this is how they immediately put them in the scene. Lighting needs fixing, of course, but you've got this idea of a sci-fi pillar set against a old kind of grungy stone column. And that's, for me, that's what Cyberpunk is about. It's what Blade Runner is about. So then I started to think, okay, this scene isn't looking good. The lighting is way off. I need to fix that. And within, I think this was almost, an hour or so, I just basically turned on the volumetric fog. This is the good old volumetric fog, and then started working the lighting. You can see the cables actually in the middle, all over the windows. The material is so dark that you just basically can't see them. I've introduced this a vertical hologram here, which doesn't actually make a huge amount of sense with the composition, because we've got these horizontal lines and you need to support that. So as soon as I did a detail lighting shot, it's like, okay, right, so because everything's white, you're seeing everything, and the diffuse values of my textures are clearly off. So that started to get addressed, as well as introducing some waterfalls to the left, because I wanted the scene to be raining and for water to kind of be pouring off the buildings. So this is some of the shop shutters at the back, some piping that was going to be foregrounded, and this was a draft of that, which you can see in the top right. And it just looked okay, but a little bit basic. I knew I could give it some more love. So started and was following this idea of big, medium, small here, which is good advice I think I saw from a video on YouTube, which is like common sci-fi mistakes or tips. Just the idea of not having the same size or type of pipe. You need to vary that. And so the one at the bottom being just this big, cylinder duct, it's not so exciting to look at. So I started then thinking about, okay, how to add value to that and break that up, because this is going to be right close to the camera. This is going to be the closest thing to the camera in the scene. So started to work on this quite a bit more. So this was working through some modeling here, and then ended up with something like this, which I was pretty chuffed with in the end. And got that in the scene and immediately started working on the hologram. So the hologram is underneath the pipes. So I took an image from a studio who, I've forgotten the name off the top of my head, which is bad. They made the graphics for Blade Runner 2049. This is off their website. So I am using that image. I made a normal map from it in Blender, so basically subdividing this mesh, putting a displacement on it, tying that to the image, putting the image in black and white, and then kind of creating a curve with it, and creating a normal map. From that, was then able to create a hologram material, which is kind of scrolling, and there's a nice kind of translucency to it. Also started making the ornate stone columns, and because the long ones are spirally, I wanted to have that spiral one. I didn't want to create the exact spiral one you see in Blade Runner, so this is one of my own design. You can see, it's quite early on in that. But the scene is starting to come together, and was around this stage I was like, okay, actually I can do this. This is all right. Started doing some renders of the stone columns. So this is in the middle. This is a high poly render, I believe, and also of the column I just showed you, and then going in and sculpting some damage into its base. This is the spiral column from the VR game, and this is a kind of iconic Blade Runner design, but because I'd already used that spiral shape in the long cylindrical columns, I didn't want to repeat it. So this is how those ended up. This is the first texture pass on it, and then going in and adding graffiti and some grime and stickers and stuff, and some wetness, so it really looks grungy. And then jumping ahead, so I'd actually just show you how they look in the scene. So this is them. This is this guy here. It's repeating over here, so it's the same column. I've just spun them around. And then this is these big ones, which are kind of, it would have been cool to kind of create actually a wider base on these that almost look like people could sit on them, and there might be some coffee cups and stuff scattered around. This is some of the scatter prop work that I still need to do, so I kind of want to go in and fill some stuff around here. But if they were realistically a kind of seating area at the same time, that could have been interesting. And then basically these are the aircon units. This fan does actually spin around, so hopefully in the video that will show up. So I started making this, and this prop absolutely kicked my ass. It's a relatively simple prop in terms of, it's just very cube-like, but I had some problems with baking that I'll quickly tell you about. The cable entry point on the right is so big because the cables in the scene I wanted to be large so that they're visible from the main shot. So proportionally it doesn't look so great. But when it's in the scene, I think it actually works. Was having problems with basically baking this mesh. Asked the kind folks over at EXP and Dynasty for some help. It actually looks like maybe they're reversed. So so this is baking the mesh to create an opacity map that can then get, yeah, you can see that's different. Okay. Eventually I remade the mesh and managed to fix it. So this is how, so it's just a simple plane with a material applied to it. And the kind of favorite part of this prop was something I added right at the end, which was just this normal detailing stamp at the front, which I quite like. And it's brrr aircon. So this is going into almost the last week. Got some rain particles in there, but still tons to do. You can see lots of block out mesh stuff still there. The waterfall's still not working, so went back in. Focal point needed addressing. Made a kind of revolving doors mesh. The texture is mirroring here because the mirror modifier is still applied, so that got fixed. Made that out of a trim sheet. And this is the giant advertising hoard that you can just see in the top right. It doesn't feature much, but I wanted to make it properly. And what I ended up doing was, it's probably a little bit too high geo, but basically unwrapped an image across the entire thing and created an emissive material for it. This is the second AC unit that I made really quickly. Those gaps in the mesh are actually just painted with a really deep dark black and a very high roughness, and I think a high metallic as well. So they just look like holes. Because these units are hidden in shadow, it worked. It's enough. This is one of the last big-ish props I made. Sorry, I didn't make this. This is a Sid Mead thing, and I really loved it. Love the curve and the suggestion of it. I mean, I still don't know what it is, but it's very cyberpunky. So I set about making a version of that I knew would exist mostly in silhouette because of how that sits in the scene. The lighting is mostly behind it. Well, in this, I think I ended up pushing this a bit more, so you could show off the front as well. So I kind of ended up trying to work the silhouette a little bit more on the left, and having some cables coming out of it. Did an explode bake for it, and then started re-looking at this area in the middle with the cables, because you can see it about a little bit earlier on. The cables are a complete jumbled mess. Like they were temporary. So then, now that I knew how to actually do some okay curves with spline meshes without them twisting and breaking, I set about improving this area. There's still a lot of repeating loops, so that's just because I copied and pasted them over to the right. So I went back in later and manually kind of put more love into that area. And this is the unit, and then here we have the advertising horde, and this is some beautiful scenes in the new Half-Life. This is one of the later props I made, foregrounded bollard, which is based off an Art Deco design. So this exists, and I wanted a hologram to actually run through them so that they look kind of ghostly. It's almost Bioshocky to me. So this is the high poly, and then this is it, low poly textured, and I think they look pretty damn good. Probably could light them better to show them off a bit more, but I like the copper, oxidized copper approach. This is the second, so this has a hologram strip running through them, and I was creating a normal map for the hologram so that I could create that hologram. So you can see that just running through these bollards. And this is me just playing around with the material instance, pushing the values in different directions and trying to find the right middle ground of color and luminance and some bin bag sculpts. Happy with the material on that actually, but could have done a lot more with, this is mostly relying very heavily on the material more than the sculpt. You can see how basic the sculpt is. But I was really trying to ratchet stuff out pretty fast at this point, whilst, not skipping it, but just like trying to make the right decisions. And knowing that these would exist mostly in shadow, I just felt there's no point spending a huge amount of time sculpting. So it was around this time I brought in there's a plant which you can see in the focal point. That's a Megascans asset. That's, I think, the only Megascans. Well, there's some small plants. Those are the only Megascans props I used. I used Megascans decals for this scene, but it made a real difference having a high level of detail that really draws the eye. I created these vending machines quite quickly, quite like the variety of shapes here and how they're kind of propped up on bricks on the right and stuff. So really happy with them, and knowing that for storytelling I needed a character, I looked to the Paragon assets in the Unreal engine, and I wanted someone kind of foregrounded and dead. So I took this guy. What's his name again? I literally can't even remember. Please forgive me, Paragon. So he just looked like a relatively generic humanoid that was wearing something that, as you can just see, I quite like that he's half in shadow, half out. Then I also used that a different skin of that character here to create the silhouetted character, and I've kind of sunk him actually back into the glass, but I was just basically trying to create the most the right silhouette, because it is only silhouette from this point. Kind of like how he is looking out of the door. The storytelling should improve on this. You can see there's also used his weapon. There's a kind of quite a cool like smoke trail, like it's just been shot, but the logic of the storytelling for me doesn't quite work yet, so that's something I can hopefully resolve very quick. So this is breaking apart and posing him, exporting him. So if you flip him 90 degrees, that's how he looks on the floor. And then this is coming towards the end, so knowing that I had stuff coming together, started applying more decals around the scene, making plastic chairs, making small clutter props, then started getting a bit more creative with the lighting on either side, and eventually ended up with this a very yellow rectangular light. So it's very big, that one. That's throwing off, and it's catching a lot of the nice light on the underside of these pipes, catching the kind of brassiness of this detail of that pipe section, and then a very large rectangular light. Oh, that's interesting. Is that sideways? Didn't know I knew I had twisted it around. I didn't know I had twisted it that much, but basically from the camera position I was just rotating that to find the right amount. So a kind of purplish light on the left, yellowish light on the right. Just looking again at how to kind of echo these ideas of off-camera emissive lighting, or not emissives, but like big planes of light being applied to building faces, and looking at it just as the detail lighting, and kind of just pushed with this to the end, and started finding those shots again of something a bit more, so almost like a crime scene top-down view, something almost GTA. I liked, whilst there's repeating assets here, I just thought it makes for an interesting image. There's good kind of color contrast here. You got the purples or the pinks set against greens, and then here this is the main shot, and then post-processing wise I kind of went in and added a small amount of film grain, and for the main this shot here, basically just literally rotated the camera by about 2 degrees. So this isn't actually looking, at a kind of flat angle. There's a tiny amount of an angle in there, and it just creates a lot more of an interesting movement in the shot, I think. So that's me, effectively just showing that from beginning to end of how this is made. What I want to go and do now is create a fly through and create a video that shows it in motion, and you got some motion from the waterfalls here and some rain. For me, that's not quite enough, so I would love to find a way of this week creating a VFX shader that pushes or throws some paper down the street. That would be awesome. and also some overhead shadows from cars. So you get the sense of stillness in the scene, like a crime's just been committed, everyone's run away, there's no one here apart from the murderer. And there's a sense of stillness, but there's movement as well, and that can hopefully be communicated with sound. So yeah, thanks for listening. Hopefully next time I will have a video ready for you. So cheers. Nice one.